Alright, hello there guys. So today I'm going to be doing a presentation on Phylum mollusca. My name is Jacob Resendez Biology1, section 48822/48825. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started now. So the first thing we're going to start off with is body symmetry. So the body symmetry of a mollusk is going to be bilateral. They have bilateral symmetry. And so in saying that, I mean that the body can be separated into two even parts down the middle. So as you can see in this diagram right here, here is the plane of symmetry right down the middle. Here is two equal sides. And that's pretty much it. Okay, so next we're gonna go over what a mollusk is. So they're separated into three different classes, which are right here. Let me just get this focused. There we go. So we got your gastropods, your bivalves, and your cephalopods. You really need to understand exactly what these are because later on in the presentation, I'm gonna be referring to them as these three classes right here. It's important that you know the difference between the three. The first one is going to be snails and slugs, or gastropods, okay? The second one is going to be clams, mussels, and scallops. Those are going to be your bivalves. And the third class is going to be cephalopods. That's going to be your squid, your octopus, and your cuttlefish. This is a cuttlefish right here. Okay, so that's the difference. We got your gastropods, your bivalves, and your cephalopods. What makes them unique? So they have three unique structures specific to mollusks. Every mollusk has these three structures. So the first structure is going to be the muscular foot. It's going to be used for body movement and mobility. So if you look at these diagrams right here, the muscular feet are going to be the pink areas. So the muscular feet on a snail is pretty much the whole bottom half, the slimy part that they use to move on. For a clam, it's going to be a tongue-like appendage that comes out of the shell that they use to push themselves around the floor or wherever they're at. And then for squid, they have an evolutionary adaptation which turned their muscular feet into tentacles. And next we have the visceral mass. This is going to be where most of the internal organs are. So it's basically the area that contains most of the internal organs. It's like a little specific region. So right here we have visceral mass in the squid. We have the visceral mass of the clam. And then up here in the front on the snail, it's towards the top of the shell underneath it. That's their visceral mass. And then lastly, we have the mantle. So what a mantle is a folded tissue that drapes over the visceral mass and secretes a shell if one is present. So not every mollusk has a shell. For example, and if they do have a shell, sometimes it's very small. So for example, a squid, it still has a mantle. It's the green part right here on the side of the squid. And as you can see, it's very small. And then we have the clam, which obviously has a shell covering pretty much the whole body. And then on the snail, obviously, they have shells. And for example, an octopus does still have a mantle, but it doesn't have a shell at all. But they are still mollusks and they still have a mantle. Okay, so we're going to move on from that. How do they eat? So starting off, a gastropod, or a snail, is going to have what's called a radula, and that's going to be this textured area around the mouth, and they're going to use that to scrape and scoop algae off of rocks or whatever surface they're crawling on, and they're going to use whatever they scraped off to consume it. So like I said, they're going to use that radula, or this textured area around their mouth. All right, they also can do filter feeding. This is going to be per bivalves. So filter feeding means that the organism is going to consume oxygen from their gills for cellular respiration, and they're going to bring in those particles along with the water that they use to breathe. So like I said, they're gonna breathe how they normally would using their gills, and when they absorb that water, not absorb it, but when they take it in to absorb oxygen, plankton will come along with that water and they will consume that. So that's what it means to filter feed. They're going to use their gills to consume plankton or algae or other particles. And lastly, a cephalopod is going to capture their prey with their muscular foot or their tentacles, and they're going to bring the organism to their mouth, which is in the middle of the tentacles here. Okay, so for reproduction, mollusks can reproduce both sexually and asexually. And by saying this, I mean that so specifically gastropods or snails and slugs are the only ones that could reproduce asexually. And so that doesn't even 100% mean that all gastropods can reproduce or do reproduce asexually. It's just something that they can do. So most gastropods are hermaphrodites, which means they are both male and female. So they can produce the male sperm and the female egg and reproduce by themselves. Or they could be a male or a female to reproduce sexually if that's necessary. So it's just dependent on whatever given situation that organism is in. But as far as bivalves, which are clams, or cephalopods, which are octopus, they only reproduce sexually. They are not asexual. And so bisexual, I mean there is a male specific and there's a female specific. There's one that has sperm and there's one that has unfertilized eggs. And together they form a new organism, which you can see from this cycle right here. So for bivalves, which are clams, they need water to reproduce. They release their sperm, they release their eggs into the water. But for cephalopods, that's not the case. They don't need water. They reproduce via intercourse, I guess you can say. Okay, so for habitats, mollusks can be found on just about any habitat on Earth. So in saying this, I mean that specifically gastropods can survive on any habitat on Earth. And since gastropods are mollusks, you can say that they can be found on just about any habitat on Earth. So here is an example of a gastropod living in a very extreme environment that you wouldn't expect to see it. Here is the scientific name for this specific gastropod, and this is in the desert. So here we got some temperatures. I have converted it into Fahrenheit for you guys to understand a little bit better what I'm talking about. Here's the surface, right? So this is what a gastropod would be crawling around. I doubt they would do it in the sunlight, but as you can see, the snail is still on the ground. 65 degrees Celsius is equivalent to 149 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's very hot, and it's still surviving. And then as far as the air goes, that's 109.4 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you're curious, its actual shell towards the center is 56 degrees Celsius, which is equivalent to 132 degrees Fahrenheit. So like I said, they can survive in very extreme conditions. Gastropods are very resilient. But as far as bivalves, which are clams, or cephalopods go, which are squids and octopus, they only survive in water. Bivalves or clams can be in fresh water, but for the most part, everything else is going to be found in the ocean. All right, and here's my works cited page. I'll give you a moment to look at that if you're curious. All right, and that's the end. Thank you for listening.